Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good opportunity to catch up with old friends and make some new ones. For those who don't know me, my name is Simon, and welcome to the church where I'm privileged to be the minister. It's good to have you here at Bloomsbury. Some of you I know have been to Theology Live before, but if this is your first one, a particular welcome to you. We're going to be hearing in a moment from Steve, and I'll do a brief introduction to him for those of you who don't know who Steve is. But just before I do, it's my turn to do a book plug. So last year, I published a book of prayers and poems called Faith in Doubt. It's prayers written over 10 years for use in public worship here at Bloomsbury, and then some poems at the end. I'm a little bit self-conscious about the poems, but anyway, there we go. They're there. So if you're interested in that, it's on Amazon and it's a tenner, and it's had some nice reviews, which I'm very gratified about. And if it helps you in your leading of public worship and your development of prayer life of your congregation, I would love to know about that. If you think it's terrible, just keep that to yourself. Okay, so it's my absolute privilege to introduce Steve, who has been part of Theology Live since its inception, and every year makes what I'm pretty sure is the longest journey of any of us. Well, it's a lot longer than me because my office is just there. But anyway, you come down from St Andrews, especially. Steve is senior lecturer at St Andrews University, and I was just having a little look at the areas that he publishes in. Systematic and historical theology, practical theology, philosophical theology, patristics, and you've been uncovering all sorts of fascinating things to do with Baptist history along the way. So, Steve, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing and being with us today, and we're looking forward to what you bring to us.
Thank you, Simon. It's good to be here, and good to follow Ruth. If you've not, you probably won't have read Ruth's doctorate because it's not readily available yet, but I have, and it's very, very good and well worth the read. So my title is Theology and Discernment, and I want to particularly talk about ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. But I was going to start, and I'll blame the computer because Ruth did, rather than the fact that I never got around to doing any slides. But I could have had should have had 4 pictures up here, and a game of Only Connect. I don't know if any of you watch Only Connect with Victoria Corrin, but various four completely unrelated things, and you're supposed to guess the connection. And my 4 things are John Bunyan, the present secretary of St Andrews Baptist Church, who's called David and is a friend of mine, the ideal of democracy, and Robert's Rules of Order. And I hope to show you how those are connected, or perhaps more, how all of them should be less connected to our church meeting practice or our church discernment practice than they are. What I essentially want to talk about is visions or models or ways of conceiving what a local church community is, and how those visions shape our practices, or possibly how our practices distort our visions, and how that relates to our theme of discernment. Now, I picked the word ecclesiology, which I'm always slightly worried about, because if you get beyond Baptist circles, then ecclesiology tends to mean stuff that men with beards do when they're wearing dresses, and it's about ordination, and it's about sacrament, and it's about lots of things that don't worry us as much as they worry other people. And so I mean, one of the things that I've seen said more than a few times, including at least once by a Baptist who ought to have known better, is that one of the problems with John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and this is John Bunyan, is that there's no ecclesiology. Now, there's no institutional church in Pilgrim's Progress, pretty much nowhere. There's I mean, there's a bath, in Interpreter's House. So there's kind of a wave at baptism. There's probably no real reference to communion. I think there's one in the second part of the Pilgrim, but not the first book. And that's where that sort of comment comes from. But actually, if you read Pilgrim's Progress, from the moment of his conversion to the moment he travels across Jordan into he dies, he does not go one step of his journey alone. There's always, and generally it's one person, but there's always someone with him, whether it's interpreter at the beginning, whether it's faithful, whether it's hopeful, after one of them dies. Always, this is a communal journey. Bunyan's ecclesiology in Pilgrim's Progress is extraordinarily strong, but it's not about ordination. It's not about sacrament. It's about community and fellowship and belonging together. If we're going to talk about ecclesiology as Baptists, I think we need to insist that we're not worried very much about the things that other people are worried about. We're worried about community. We're worried about being together, and that's you don't need me to tell you that's powerful. I mean, I think of various places I've seen it. Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was out there 2005. Deep South America, famously, Sunday morning is the most segregated racially moment of the week in these places. And we were in a little church by American standards, 150 folks, met in a rented warehouse. And the pastor had intentionally there in Tennessee decided that he wanted a church that reflected the ethnic diversity of the city. And so this community was a third Anglo, a third African-American, a third Hispanic, give or take. And I was there with friends, and one Sunday morning service, and twice during that one service, he actually stopped stuff and said, look, we could misunderstand something here. We need to talk about it. He was that intentional and that proactive about doing the things that were necessary to build community in that context. I mean, I was blown away. I said to Kelly, who had taken me, you got to introduce us. I was thinking about who I could get to pay to bring him over here and to do some lectures. Only Kelly did introduce us, and I realized that ministry in the UK was forever closed to this pastor. His name was Randy Neighbours. 2016, I was in Berlin doing stuff with the Baptist World Alliance, and we went to the biggest Baptist church in Germany, which is kind of suburban Berlin, I think M25 Bible Belt equivalent. We were there in January, and November had been when Angela Merkel, Chancellor, had opened the borders and allowed in 1 or 2 million refugees from various bits of the Middle East. And it was striking. Every church we saw was doing something. But this one church, it had a kind of this big modern suite of buildings that left me repenting of the sin of envy for some while after I'd seen them. If you want to give a few million to a building project, there's one in St Andrews that we haven't started yet. They'd just thrown this open all week. They'd got English classes, they got food banks, they got civic stuff, they got lawyers they were bringing in, everything, just space for people to come. They'd hired a pastor. She was female, might guess from the pronoun, and she was also Presbyterian, and so not baptized, and neither of these were within their rules, but they'd managed to ignore their rules because she spoke Farsi. And so they'd hired a Farsi-speaking pastor. And when we were there were 9 folk being baptized in 5 different languages. And leadership team worked together to make sure that the majority German congregation could understand what was going on. And I had a headset and someone was translating into English from the back, which was nice. But everyone was baptized in their own heart language. Again, just completely blown away by what was happening. I wrote on Facebook that night, if someone asked me now, what does Christianity mean? I'd want to say, come to this church and look around. It probably not perfect. I'm sure it's not perfect. But then I was telling these stories. I preached at the beginning. We fairly recently had a year's pastoral vacancy in St Andrews, and I preached the first Sunday after we'd had a fantastic ministry for Andrew Rollinson, but then he left and tried to say, we're Baptists. We don't need a minister, or we do need a minister, but we'll live for the gap, we'll cope, we'll do it like this. And was telling these stories and thinking, I don't want to be talking to them about Germany and America. I want something local. And then my oldest daughter came in and she was sixth form at that time. And we'd had a farewell do for Andrew. We'd hired one of the university buildings, had a nice do. And it happened that one of her school friends was working for the university, kind of waiting tables and stuff, and had been on staff for this. And had come in on the Monday saying to various friends, does anyone know who these people are? He said, I was, it said, some church. He said, I was at this thing. Said there were all sorts of different ages and different ethnic groups and different backgrounds, and they seem to all look after each other and care for each other's children, and I just couldn't work it out. I'd love to go and meet them, find out who they are. Now, my church is not perfect. This year we've had those interesting leaders meetings where you're aware that members of the staff team are refusing to talk to each other. We don't do this stuff perfectly, but somehow, without even thinking about it, we were living community in a way that was sufficiently striking that some 18-year-old lad from rural Scotland was enticed. That's our ecclesiology. And let's be proud of it. And let's think about what church meeting looks like in the light of that. So Bunyan, our present church secretary, a guy called David, fantastic, really fantastic in all sorts of ways. A few years ago, I found myself saying to someone, when I grow up, I want to be like David. He's really, he and his wife both have been absolutely wonderful for the church. And David's a very senior medic and has done all sorts of things, but very involved in church life all his life, very involved in charitable service. One of the things he did was chair the board of trustees of Oscar, the Scottish charity regulator. Oscar's a little more flexible than the Charity Commission, at least used to be when I was down here. They seem to have this weird idea that their job is mostly to help charities fulfill their objects, rather. But even so, they're there to. And as we started talking over the last year, the Scottish charity laws just changed. There's a new option to become something called an SCIO. The S stands for Scottish, the C stands for charity, and I don't know what the other two stand for. Anyway, there are certain advantages, and so we're talking about this. And we hit this issue that the moment in our church, the deacons are the trustees, and David, being church secretary, being one of the deacons, being having this background of working at a very high level in charitable governance, kept talking about what trustees needed to do. And in a very civilized way, he and I had a bit of an argument about it. And I said, no, let's talk about what a church needs to do. And once we work that out, if it happens that we can find a way in charity law to incorporate ourselves and get some benefits, that's great. But if we can't, forget it. We are not trustees. First and foremost, we are church leaders. And if we need to, if we need to become trustees to gain some charitable benefits, then that is entirely contingent and secondary to how we do things. And this is kind of where I want to say, what's our vision of what it is to be a church? Is it driven by charity law? Are we trying to be a well-run charity? I noticed that both what we call the union and this thing you've got down south have started in documents talking about church leaders as trustees. And I get that. I mean, we've got 18 different models of church leadership that we know of, and as soon as we write them down, someone will invent the 20th. And you've got to say something. But it does worry me that our primary identification of church leaders is trustees, because that's just saying, it's just putting the emphasis wrong. It's saying what we fundamentally are is a charity. No, what we fundamentally are is a church. If some form of charitable organization established in law is useful clothing for us to wear to walk this decade and next, then fine, let's use that. But the moment it becomes ill-fitting, we need to discard it without a thought, because it's not who we are. It's just a way of trying to make some sort of sense of our life together within the legal structures that exist. Democratic ideals. I don't think really anyone still reads E.Y. Mullins, Edgar Young Mullins. He very, very significant leader about 120 years ago, Southern Baptist. He was president of Southern Seminary, and then of the convention, was active in Baptist World Alliance affairs, and did various things, but probably his most lasting contribution was a book called The Axioms of Religion, which is a very of its time book that tries to do this kind of slightly Schleiermachian general theory of religion. And he's got 6 axioms, and then he says, but underlying all of them is one basic idea, which he calls soul competency, the ability of every individual human person to relate to God in an unmediated way. And this is the Baptist ideal, and because this is the Baptist ideal, true religion is Baptist, and yada yada. Now, the bit about all religions like this, just put that to one side, it's not its time. Soul competency actually works really well as a summary of Baptist identity. I don't think it's perfect. I've written about why I don't think it's perfect, but actually if you start to think about it, most of our distinctives fall out of that sort of idea pretty quickly, and as a result it was quite popular. You can find that language in Baptist World Alliance statements, at least down to the beginning of the Second World War, and so really quite influential as to how we narrated ourselves. Having established this in his book, The Axioms of Religion, Mullins goes on to make a series of extravagant claims about the world entering the Baptist age. And his argument for this is that Baptist faith and democratic politics belong together, mutually reinforce each other. And because the world is becoming democratic, the world is becoming Baptist. Now, you can criticize quite a lot of the premises in that particular argument, but maybe it looked good in 1906. I don't know. But Baptist faith and democratic politics belong together, and he tries to work this out. There is, I mean, the most astonishing typological reading of the American flag. The stars, each separated because each believer is competent on their own, but all set in heaven. And I can't remember what he does with the stripes, but the American flag is an image of a perfect Baptist identity because it's an image of a perfect democratic identity. Well, it's easy to laugh, but we vote. We even, when it comes to significant decisions, calling a minister, perhaps, we even give people ballot papers. I know what to do with a ballot paper. I've been taught. You go in and you pick up your stubby pencil and you look for the candidate who you prefer, or who you think will best represent your interests or best promote the policies that you want promoted. And then you think a bit about tactical voting, and then you vote for whoever it might be. Is that what we're doing when we're calling a minister? How successfully do we manage to hand out ballot papers and teach people to do something completely different with them? When we first handed out ballot papers, it wasn't far from here, actually, in about 1820, one of the London churches. It was just between Bentham's plea for universal suffrage, which had been howled down, and what was called at the time the Great Reform Act. Now, the Great Reform Act did some good things. It got rid of the rotten boroughs, which were essentially parliamentary constituencies with only one person in them. But what it effectively did, apart from those sorts of reforms, was change the setup so that whereas before roughly the richest 5% of male landowners got the vote, afterwards roughly the richest 10% of male landowners got the vote. And while that was controversial down the road in Westminster, just that way there was a church giving a ballot paper to every member, young or old, male or female, servant, landowner. Yeah, they get one too, but they get one. No more than anyone else. That was prophetic. That was saying something really powerful. Now, when we give out ballot papers, I wonder what we say. Are our practices actually telling people that we envisage the church as a democratic society? And if so, is that a bad vision? Okay, John Bunyan, our church secretary, the ideal of democracy and Robert's Rules of Order. I don't know if you know, well, I do know that you know Robert's Rules of Order. I don't know if you know that you know Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order are the standard ways of conducting a meeting. So, Robert's Rules of Order says, a subject for consideration at the meeting shall be validly proposed and shall require a seconder before it may be discussed, and then amendments may be put and the amendments will be voted on, and then the motion as amended, if it has been, will be put to the vote, and the chair chooses who shall speak, and this sort of stuff. That's Robert's rules, and we all live by them because you have to, really. You have to live by some rules, and these are just so universal that we've all unconsciously adopted them. And I don't fundamentally have a problem with Robert's Rules of Order. They do what they need to. If you're going to have a structured meeting of more than, say, 20 people, you're going to need something like this. And I don't think there's anything that I've seen in Robert's Rules that I think I wish that was different. But Robert's Rules of Order are the way to run a Victorian voluntary society. And we're not a Victorian voluntary society, we're a church. And when church meeting is the only meeting that people are given the dignity of participation in, which used to be true for quite a lot of our members, that doesn't matter at all. But actually, when people are quite used to being in these sorts of meetings, when the Rotary Club they're a part of, or the squash club they're a part of. No one does squash anymore, do they? Whatever. There's an ultimate frisbee club they're a part of. When you've got lots of experience of different voluntary associations that run themselves this way, for the church to run itself the same way is to construct ourselves as a voluntary association. And in important ways, we're not. One of the things that happened when we had our year's pastoral vacancy was we had 25 of the students who were worshipping with us asked to join the church. They wanted to say who the next pastor was going to be. But, you know, great. In a way, it was tidying up an anomaly. They were definitely part of us. Some of them were preaching occasionally. Some of them were leading worship fairly regularly. Lots of them were teaching our kids, you know, running our youth groups. It was entirely appropriate they should be church members. I found myself with our student worker sitting one morning, and we had kind of one in every half hour. So we saw about 10 or 12 of these students just because we needed to, you know, do the stuff you need to do. And I found myself trying to explain to a student who probably wasn't from a Baptist church background what it meant to be a church member. And the thing I landed on quite quickly and said to each one of them was, if you become a member, you give the church the right and the duty to interfere in your life. I said, when you graduate from here, you're going to go away. And if you choose to become, you know, if you don't become a member, that's fine. You can go away and we'd love to hear from you. But that's, if you do choose to become a member, we will be wanting to know where you've gone and where you're worshipping and whether you've found a place, a new church to call home. And until you do find a new church to call home, we will feel that we've got some sort of responsibility to tell you that you should be looking and to ask you how it's going. And we're not a voluntary society. We're a covenanted community. We take responsibility for each other. We claim the right to interfere in each other's lives. So my worry when we talk about ecclesiology and practices of discernment is that the things we do in our church meetings construct us as something other than what we are. We should be Bunyan's pilgrim, walking through the troubles of life with sisters and brothers alongside us to encourage us, to rebuke us when we need it, to help us. If you know Pilgrim's Progress, you know, the kind of the last scene, they're crossing the River Jordan, which is an image for death, and Pilgrim suddenly loses hope. He is desperately afraid, and is it hopeful or faithful who's with him at that point? I can't remember. Anyway, whoever's with him at that point holds his head above the waters and helps him through. Even at that final moment of death, he needs Christian fellowship to successfully traverse the troubles of life. And if we do things that unconsciously teach us that we're a business or a Victorian Voluntary Association or a democratic assembly, then we're missing a vital truth about who we are. I think this is particularly a problem for, I was about to say our generation. It's a phrase I must stop using. You know, some of us were ministering in a previous millennium. I commented to someone last night. I was on a train that was delayed. We got talking about just but one of the guys I was talking to worked for Asda, senior manager of some sort. He'd been in post when Walmart had control of them. Apparently they've sold up now, but just picking up on some of the stuff Ruth began with, he was commenting that this American colleague who was a Mormon came over, very, very serious, very, very everything. And at one point they were having a conversation about the use of space in the stores. This guy said, the problem is, Philip, too much alcohol, far too much alcohol. It's immoral. This guy I was chatting to said, I felt I just couldn't let this slip. I said, I've been in a Walmart in America. You're selling people semi-automatic rifles. I said, this guy looked at me very seriously and said, Philip, the only time there's a problem with guns in America is when someone's been drinking alcohol first, which I suspect is not true. But yeah, why did I start on that? We got chatting. Sorry. Yes, I was talking to lots of people on the train. What we do needs to shape, or needs to be shaped by who we are, because then it will shape who we are. And one of the problems we face at the moment is most of us are in communities, churches, where the tacit knowledge of how to be Baptist, or what it is to be Baptist, has been lost. Now, I was an undergraduate in Cambridge just before the Baptist Society, the Robert Hall Society it was called, closed. And that was about the last, there may have been one that survived it. But, go back and there were Baptist societies in all the universities. And the assumption was that if you went to university from a Baptist home, your minister wrote to the minister of the church, the Baptist church in the town, saying, this young man, the assumption probably was that you were a young man back in the day. This young man is coming and will be joining you. And the assumption was you were Baptist. And whatever was right or wrong about that, it did mean that we had communities that had grown up understanding, feeling tacit knowledge in Polanyi's terms, what it is to be Baptist. That they knew what you did in a church meeting. They knew they'd been formed into this practice. David, my church secretary, and his wife, they before they joined us, they were in a Church of Scotland parish in Edinburgh, and I can't remember where they were before that. But like many people, they've been around and they've looked for the church that, in their case, the church they felt they could serve best. The particular parish they were in Edinburgh was a small and struggling one, and between them, they kind of ran it for a long while. And so, David arrives and starts talking about being a trustee because that's what he knows. And I have to start talking about what it is to be a Baptist and how that doesn't necessarily fit our vision. What can we do practically to change all this? I think the first thing is to know who we are and to talk about who we are and to see how to try to show people how that should be shaping our practices. Maybe we actually need to be far more intentional about decoupling from some of these other things. Maybe if our deacons are our trustees, they actually should have separate meetings. Trustees meeting once a quarter, a deacons meeting the other months. Maybe in our church meetings, we ought to separate business from discernment, decision from discernment, as Ruth put it. Whether that's, again, we have the odd business meeting where we just do business and get that out the way, or whether it's in each church meeting, there is a section that is business. And then there is a very clear kind of line, and after this, we're doing something different. And to talk intentionally, like Randy Neighbours did, to talk intentionally to our communities about what we're doing and why we're doing it, because we're trying to be a particular sort of community and to shape that together. Probably we do need to find different ways of talking. The small group work for slow discernment. I was in a group at the back there when we were talking after this. I suppose someone said, I don't know how you do, how you change it. Well, maybe what you do is knowing that you can't change the church meeting, you introduce a whole set of other things. Let's we're going to have church meetings every third month, and the months in between we'll get together to pray and talk about the things that are going on in the church, and then we'll take some of that into the church. It might work, but food makes a difference. Food makes a big difference to all things. I mean, this is, once again, I'm getting old. When I was training for ministry at Spurgeon's, we had a young curate come and talk to us about a new program for evangelism that he was very excited about. His name was Nicky Gumbel, and the program was something called Alpha. And he was explaining how it worked and said the Holy Spirit weekend is what makes it work. And I listened to it. I thought, no, the food's what makes it work. I still think I'm right. But eating together is extraordinarily powerful in terms of talking, sharing, whatever. So I kind of want to ask, who are we? Who is, our local church, who are we? Are we a business or a charity or a democratic assembly or a voluntary association? Or are we disciples called and gathered together by Jesus, covenanted to walk together and to watch over each other? And if we think the answer is obvious, then what would someone like Ruth, who came to observe our church meetings, what answer would they come up with? If someone just read our constitution, what would they think it described? And if then the answer is less obvious, how do we change what we do? How do we change the formal documents we live by so that they tell the truth about who we are? Now, one last story and I'll finish, just because the danger with all this stuff is that we get very Pelagian about it, if you'll forgive the theological term. We start thinking, we've got to do this right. God will speak. God will guide. We can try really hard to stop God speaking and God guiding from time to time, and occasionally God might let us. But we again, I was saying to folk earlier, we tend to have our church meetings in the church sanctuary. It's the only room we've got that's big enough. That's why we need a building project. It's upstairs, means some of our members actually can't join in because they can't manage the stairs. Nowhere in the building to put a lift. We sit in serried rows like you're sitting now with someone at the front, and everything about the space is wrong in terms of trying to do this stuff right. And the meeting, I remember the meeting when we called our current pastor, and I was really worried about it. So we've been talking to this guy, Abby, his name is, well, we had the meeting at Easter week, and we first met him in September. So we've been talking to him for how long that is, 6 months, 8 months. And he'd written to us. He was presently ministering in the Church of Scotland, but felt he wanted to move to a Baptist church, and we kind of looked at this and said, no, this isn't, no. But we ought to meet him. And so a couple of them met him, and from there on, we got excited, and so it went forward. And Abby was born in Congo, DRC, came to this country about 20 years ago, and has been ministering here since. And I was aware that there were mutterings, and people seem to have settled on the question of accent as bluntly, a slightly acceptable way of saying we don't want a black minister. And I kept hearing this, and maybe they really did mean, but actually we've got people with Texan accents preaching in the church. We've got people with English accents. We've got people with Glaswegian accents. Our associate pastor is Dutch by birth. We've got people with Korean accents. Abby's accent really wasn't that much of an issue. Certainly far easier to understand than the Texans and the Glaswegians. But apparently we have to put up with Glaswegians because they're Scottish. And the meeting started going that way. I was just sitting there. It was being chaired by our external moderator, of course, and I thought, this is going badly. This isn't going to go. The other part of this is for reasons entirely down to utter stupidity of an earlier generation. We have a 90% minimum call vote, which does make it very, very difficult for anyone who isn't exactly out of the identikit mold to get called to the church. And I thought, this is going to happen. I thought, and then the person sitting in front of me stood up. And, we've talked about the diffident voices that get silenced by that sort of setup of meeting. And St Andrews is not an easy church meeting. I mean, I don't suppose I help very much, but there's 4 of my colleagues from the theology department. There's at that point, he's now housebound, lovely guy, but past president of the Royal Society, who has fairly strong views on a fair number of things. But basically, everybody is, or not quite everybody, but there's a lot of people who are very high-powered and who know stuff. And the person sitting in front of me, 14, not at that point a church member, but we let people come and speak in meetings. And in a very stuttering and brief comment, he said something, and it wasn't profound. It was kind of, somebody said, we need someone who will appeal to young people. Well, I think Abby will appeal to young people, and that was about it. But that intervention changed the meeting. You know how you sit in the meeting and you hear people saying, and you think it's going that way. And suddenly it was going a completely different way. And I hold on to that still 5 years down the line as a moment when perhaps despite all our best efforts in terms of setup and everything else, church meeting worked. We heard the prophetic voice. It did turn things around. We called Abby on a nearly unanimous vote. And, you know, despite pandemic, despite whatever else, I don't think in our better moments, any of us have regretted it since. There was one of my fellow elders commented, this is not going to be safe or easy. And it hasn't been safe or easy, but it's been good. Okay, how do you want to do this, Andy? Let's just open stuff. Yeah. Have a microphone.